Every government on Earth today has a founding document, a constitution, a declaration, a treaty, something written down by someone who decided this is how we will be ruled. But the very first government in human history had none of that. No one wrote it, no one voted on it, no one even agreed to it. It didn't start as an idea at all. It started as a problem nobody knew how to solve. And the solution, almost by accident, became something none of the people living through it would have recognized as government. They just thought they were figuring out who gets to keep the grain. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the moment right after humans stopped moving. For most of our history, there was no one in charge of you beyond your own family, because there was nothing to be in charge of. A band of 30 or 40 people doesn't need a tax collector. It doesn't need a court. If someone wrongs you, everyone already knows about it by sundown, and the group deals with it together. Authority, in the modern sense, simply had no job to do. Then people started storing grain, and the moment food stopped being something you ate the day you found it and became something you locked away for next winter, an entirely new category of problem appeared. Whose grain was it really? The family that planted it? The village that built the storage pit? What happens when the harvest is bad and someone's children are starving next to a pit that isn't theirs? These weren't hypothetical questions. They were daily, urgent, and completely unprecedented, because no hunter-gatherer band in 10,000 generations had ever needed an answer to who owns the food after it's already been picked. For a long time, historians assumed the answer was obvious. The strong took charge, and government was really just organized theft with better branding. Mancor Olson's famous stationary bandit idea captures this version well. A warlord realizes he can extract more from people over time by protecting them and taxing them steadily than by robbing them once and moving on. It's a real pattern, and it shows up again and again in history. But it isn't the whole story, and recent research has actually complicated it in an important way. In 2023, economists Robert Allen, Mattia Bertazzini, and Leander Heldring published a study in the American Economic Review looking at exactly when and where the earliest states formed in ancient Mesopotamia. What they found didn't fit the pure conquest and extraction model. States were significantly more likely to appear in places where communities suddenly needed large-scale irrigation, usually after losing direct access to a river. In other words, the trigger wasn't a warlord showing up to dominate people. It was small settlements facing a problem none of them could solve alone, digging and maintaining a canal system big enough to keep everyone fed, and discovering that the only way to do it was to build a new kind of institution that could coordinate hundreds of households who weren't related to each other and didn't automatically trust one another.
That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. A family can dig a small ditch. It cannot dig, maintain, and fairly allocate water from a canal system serving 40 villages. Somebody has to decide the schedule. Somebody has to enforce it when someone upstream tries to take more than their share. Somebody has to resolve the argument when the schedule and the drought don't cooperate. None of these jobs existed a generation earlier. And once they existed, once someone was actually doing them, that person didn't go back to being an ordinary farmer once the canal was finished. The role stayed. Archaeologist Robert M.C. Adams spent decades studying the Mesopotamian city of Uruk and reached a related conclusion from a different angle. As population grew around the earliest urban centers, Adams argued, society couldn't run on kinship anymore, the old system where your obligations to people were defined by who your relatives were. There were simply too many strangers living too close together. What replaced kinship were new institutions organized around class and residence instead of bloodline, disembedded, specialized roles that existed independent of any one family. A grain administrator wasn't your uncle anymore, he was a position, and a position outlives the person who happens to be standing in it, which is precisely what makes it the seed in something like a state instead of just a helpful neighbor. Here's where it gets stranger. Not every early farming society down this path actually built a state, and the exception tells you something important about why the ones that did. The anthropologist James C. Scott pointed out that the earliest states in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica were built almost exclusively on grain crops: wheat, barley, rice, maize. Societies that instead relied on crops like potatoes, cassava, or beans, even ones with plenty of food and dense population, did not develop the same kind of centralized state administration nearly as readily. The reason, Scott argued, comes down to something almost embarrassingly practical. Grain ripens all at once, sits above ground where it can be seen and can be measured, divided, stored, and hauled away. A tuber can be left in the dirt indefinitely and dug up whenever a family actually needs it, which makes it nearly impossible for anyone else to know how much you have or take a cut of it. Grain, Scott put it, is visible, accessible, and taxable in a way almost nothing else a Neolithic farmer grew could be. States didn't just happen to form where grain was farmed, they formed because grain was farmed. It was the first food a stranger could tax without your permission, and once someone could tax it, someone needed to track it. This is very likely why writing itself was born the way it was. The earliest cuneiform tablets out of Uruk, dating to roughly 3400 to 3300 BC, are not poetry and they are not history. They are receipts, lists of grain, livestock, and labor, tallies of what came in and what went out. Writing appears to have been invented not to tell stories but to do accounting for a state that needed to remember who owed it what. The bureaucracy came before the literature. So take a step back and look at the whole accidental chain. Strangers living together needed to decide who kept the stored grain. Some communities needed shared irrigation to survive at all, which required coordination no single family could provide. The person who organized that coordination didn't disappear once the crisis passed. The role calcified into a position, and the position needed a way to track who had contributed what and who had received what, which required a system of records, which required something like writing. None of these steps was anyone deciding to invent government. Each one was just the next available answer to a problem the last solution had created. By the time the city of Uruk had temple administrators, tax rolls, and standardized measures around 3500 BC, nobody there would have described what happened as the founding of a government. They'd have called it, at most, the way things are handled now. That's the part worth sitting with. Every tax form, every zoning permit, every court date you've ever had to deal with is the distant descendant of a handful of farmers trying to figure out whose turn it was to use the canal and who was allowed to open the grain pit. Nobody planned government any more than anyone planned the city that grew up around it. It was the byproduct of strangers needing to trust institutions because, for the first time in human history, they'd stopped being able to trust everyone they knew.